So welcome everyone to this Waterfront Conference webinar. We're going to be talking about changing environmental requirements for major infrastructure planning, looking at biodiversity net gain and the implications of the Environment Act. My name is Rufus Howard. I'm the Impact Assessment Policy Lead at the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. And today we have two excellent speakers, Alex Minhinnick, Director at Burgess Salmon, and Nick White, Principal Advisor at Natural England on net gain and green infrastructure. Before I introduce our speakers more fully, I just want to give a quick reminder of what we're going to be talking about today. The overview for today's webinar is that recent and planned changes to policy will impact environmental requirements for major infrastructure projects. The discussion is going to consider the biodiversity net gain requirements, future of EIA, the introduction of environmental outcome assessments, and what net zero and climate change means for new infrastructure projects. We'll have short presentations from Nick and Alex, and then we're going to have hopefully a lively Q&A. So as questions occur to you, please type them into the Q&A function rather than the chat. So there's a Q&A function down on the Zoom there. Please put your questions into there. That's where I'm going to be focusing on when I moderate the discussion later rather than the chat bar. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to both our speakers before handing over to Alex. So Alex is a planning solicitor working in private practice for a wide range of developer, landowner and public authority clients. He has particular experience in the consenting of large energy and infrastructure projects under both the Town and Country Planning Act and the Planning Act 2008. He's a legal associate for the Royal Town Planning Institute, a member of the Compulsory Purchase Association, and a representative for the firm at the Mineral Products Association. Alex regularly speaks at events and conferences and publishes articles on a range of subjects in national publications. Thank you for coming today, Alex. Nick White, Principal Advisor Net Gain Green Infrastructure, as I said, Natural England. Nick works across government, national and local, with developers, NGOs and academia to advance policy, practice and standards around net gain, biodiversity, natural capital, environmental. And the current focus of his work is on biodiversity net gain legislation, the biodiversity metric, biodiversity net gain standards and guidance. He's also working on the evolving approach to marine net gain, which I'm personally interested in. As a non-ecologist, Nick is interested in how biodiversity in the natural environment can contribute towards wider social and economic benefits, and he's a strong interest in green infrastructure, especially in relation to urban areas and its ability to enhance wider infrastructure resilience. So that's enough from me. I'll invite Alex to share his screens with his presentation and hand over to Alex.
Rufus, thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. Hopefully my screen sharing is working effectively and you're able to see a nice placeholder there. Thank you for the thumbs up, Rufus. Always good to get that affirmation. As Rufus has said, my name's Alex Minhinnick. I'm a planning solicitor. I deal in the consenting of energy infrastructure, transport projects, and particularly I think with reference for today to nationally significant infrastructure projects. And what I've done today by way of slide presentation is I thought it made sense to focus in particular on the issue of biodiversity net gain. I think that's probably the area that we have the most detail on. And I've therefore prepared just a couple of slides just to talk you through things by way of introduction. And for that story, obviously the story starts with the Environment Act, which is on the statute book. It's the Environment Act 2021, so it is there. It has received royal assent. There are obviously ongoing consultations which are happening in relation to biodiversity net gain as well, and I'm confident that Nick will come on to talk about some of those and some of the detail in relation to that. There is, I think, one of the emerging themes of today's webinar is probably going to be that there is quite a lot out there that we don't actually know yet. There is lots of detail to emerge in due course, and I think I could have said that a month ago and or 6 weeks ago, and of course since then there has been major political change. We have a new government. There have been all sorts of announcements which have come out since the government was formed. There were statements which were made prior to the formation of the government. So I suppose the base point is that things could change further in the future. So I thought what I'd do is I'd keep things as straightforward as possible and focus today on what we do know to set the framework for some of the discussion that I'm sure we're going to come into. Incidentally, I think it's worth saying that NSIPs, nationally significant infrastructure projects, weren't actually originally intended to be subjected to biodiversity net gain requirements. When the Environment Act was first published as the Environment Bill at that stage, the scope of the regime was to be the Town and Country Planning Act planning regime. And it was only with an amendment fairly late in the passage of that bill that the nationally significant infrastructure project regime was brought into it. And that is probably one of the reasons why the Environment Act deals with biodiversity net gain for NSIPs and biodiversity net gain for regular planning permissions, if we call them that. Obviously they're in different statutes, so they would be dealt with differently in any event, but the timings for them coming on stream are also being phased differently. So what's this all about in the Environment Act in legislative terms? Well, there will be a new statutory requirement which will be written into the Planning Act 2008, which will say in terms that a development consent order, so the consent that nationally significant infrastructure projects need, should not be granted unless the Secretary of State is satisfied that the biodiversity gain statement has been satisfied. So what will the biodiversity gain statement say is probably then the next question. What the gain statement will say, it will say many things, but the key thing that it will address is what the biodiversity objective is to be. And it's that term, biodiversity objective, which is around which all of this revolves. And what we do know about that is that it will be a gain in biodiversity value of at least 10%. It could be greater. And there is also provision in there for that minimum level of 10% to be changed by subsequent legislation in due course. We also know that provision has been written into the biodiversity net gain provisions as they relate to the Planning Act 2008 regime for there to be what will be known as excluded development. And excluded development is what it sounds like. It will be development that will not be subject to the requirements of biodiversity net gain. So we know that mechanism is there. We know that carve out or exemption process is there. I don't think we know very much more about what that will look like or what developments that will apply to, but that could be something that we come on to talk about. What else will the biodiversity gain statement say? Well, it will deal with how biodiversity is to be calculated, which is obviously quite an important piece in all of this, and that feeds into the metrics, which again, there is lots more to speak about. It will deal with, the gain statement will deal with which metric should be used for the calculation of biodiversity. The legislation speaks of a concept known as pre-development value, which is the baseline against which the future biodiversity state of the land in question should be judged. So it's the baseline against which you judge future biodiversity status. And what the gain statement should set out is what that means and when it is to be calculated, because obviously that is quite an important piece in the mechanism. The other key thing that I wanted to flag is that it will specify how value is to be attributable to biodiversity. And the particular thing that we're talking about there is the spatial hierarchy of where biodiversity is to be delivered, because there is I'll come on to this again in a second in a bit more detail, but there is a spatial hierarchy which is to be applied. So what does this mean then for the underlying policy base? Because we have national policy statements which govern decision making on nationally significant infrastructure projects. There are a range of existing national policy statements which provide policy to guide the Secretary of State in their decision making. And what the Environment Act tells us is that there will be an obligation to include a biodiversity gain statement, so the statement that I've been talking about, in an NPS where it is reviewed for the first time. And that's really the mechanism by which the policy basis will come in. There is also a discretionary mechanism which is written into the Act, which allows for the adoption of an independent freestanding biodiversity gain statement for relevant infrastructure or development types without a review of the national policy statement being carried out. So those are the two mechanisms by which this biodiversity gain statements are going to come into play. And finally then, before I move on to delivery mechanisms, all of this has been spoken about in the future tense. And the reason why I'm doing that is because none of these provisions as they relate to nationally significant infrastructure projects are yet in force. There have been no commencement orders which have been made in relation to them. There's no legislative date specified for when they will commence. I think what we do have is we have an indication, and it's in the DEFRA consultation which came out at the beginning of this year, so in January of 2022, to which I'm not aware a response or a summary of responses has been made yet. But what that consultation said was that there is an aspiration for the provisions as they relate to NSIPs to be in place by 2025. And there has been a separate statement that the biodiversity gain statements would be published 2 years prior to that. So that would be 2023. That, of course, was said earlier this year. And where we get to with that is very much open to discussion given recent political change. So my final slide, delivery mechanisms. Lots, I think, of the biodiversity net gain regime for these projects is you obviously have the consenting piece and where that sits within the policy statement and how you show that you're delivering biodiversity net gain. And really the I suppose the sharp end of the process is going to be in how the land, and we are, I think, for the most part talking about the use of specified plots of land, how that land is going to be secured for the purposes of biodiversity, and then how that will be taken into account under the regime. And we do have this clear indication of a spatial hierarchy. So at the top of the hierarchy and of most value will be on-site mitigation, which is obviously within the development footprint. And if you are to rely on anything in the planning regimes in their broader sense, you have to be able to show that the matter that you're relying on is secured, and that's also true for biodiversity net gain. The twin mechanisms that are envisaged for on-site mitigation are either existing Section 106 obligations or their equivalent in the nationally significant infrastructure regime, and this new concept of a conservation covenant, which it's a covenant which is made in relation to land, and it includes obligations to maintain that land in certain status. And the benefit of that is obviously then taken and applied into the net gain mechanism. Next down the pyramid, we have off-site mitigation, which is the same concept, but obviously it's delivered off-site. And it's worth touching here on another concept that emerges and it applies particularly, I think, for off-site mitigation. And this is the idea of a biodiversity gain site register, which is a register that would be established, identifying these sites where biodiversity has been delivered on an off-site basis in order to increase transparency, improve monitoring, and generally improve access to the regime overall. And again, the same point comes for offsite mitigation. It needs to be secured if it is going to be relied on. And again, you come down to those same mechanisms of conservation covenants and potentially other existing regimes like Section 106 or equivalent obligations. And finally, we have at the bottom of the hierarchy, and therefore, as I understand it, intended to be of the least value within the calculations, we have this idea of biodiversity credits. And again, there has been a consultation on what these might look like, but we haven't received that feedback from that consultation process, and therefore lots of the detail of how that credit regime may operate is to be confirmed in due course. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time and bearing with me during that short presentation. I'll now pass back to Rufus and Nick.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. That was excellent. And I've certainly got some questions written down. So if you have questions for Nick, please type them into the question and answer panel. I'd now like to invite Nick to share his screen, and we'll listen to what Nick's got for us.
That's great. Thank you. Move my slides on. Yeah, so Alex gave you a really helpful kind of run through in terms of the legislation. I just like to kind of step back briefly and just think, why are we talking about biodiversity net gain in the first place as well? What's the value, what the benefits that we think this could actually achieve, both in terms of infrastructure projects and more broadly for nature? So one of the things that has come through certainly through early piloting work that was done over the last kind of 5 or 6 years was around the way that biodiversity net gain can potentially help to improve elements of project certainty, reduce some of the kind of risks, particularly around planning and consenting risks and delays that can often arise, particularly in relation to environmental matters, with schemes running into difficulties, local objections on environmental grounds. And so the idea of having a much more standardized, consistent approach that's quite transparent, that looks to consider all aspects of biodiversity, so that it's hopefully schemes are less prone to kind of challenge and objection on unreasonable grounds, where they've actually been able to demonstrate they're actually addressing environmental issues as well. So, and the schemes that we know that have done it, and there are a number of both NSIPs and other kind of infrastructure projects that are already kind of committed to and being delivering biodiversity net gain. We know that typically on a kind of in terms of the costs to them, it's at less than 1% of the overall capital costs of the project as well. So so it's not necessarily something, it can come with benefits, cost benefits in terms of reduced delays and for little direct costs to the project. And obviously there are kind of reputational benefits to this as well. It's a mechanism for being able to demonstrate to local communities and other stakeholders around what projects are doing and delivering for nature and for the wider environment. And it's also a space that investors are increasingly getting interested in as well. Typically to date, the interest had been heavily around kind of issues around net zero and carbon, but increasingly the investment community is picking up on the nature emergency as well. And so being able to demonstrate what a scheme's doing in terms of for nature is quite helpful too. We do live in a changing climate, as sadly people in Florida are experiencing at the moment. But we know as well that green infrastructure in and around grey infrastructure assets can help improve the overall resilience of those grey assets as well. And net gain does provide a mechanism for valuing the provision of kind of green space, green infrastructure, etc., around grey assets, and that in turn can help protect that asset as well and protect its future performance. And then obviously this is all in part to help address the nature emergency that we are experiencing in the UK and globally. It's not a silver bullet, but it will help make a considerable contribution towards the challenge that nature is experiencing. And actually some of the habitats that we are expecting to be provided through net gain can themselves also make contributions towards the wider kind of net zero aspirations as well, and in terms of their ability to sequestrate carbon or kind of reduce carbon emissions into the wider atmosphere. So there is some potential for kind of win-wins there as well. And actually, to be fair to infrastructure projects, they've pretty much led the way in much of this as well. So a lot of the early work that was done on early pilots of the metric, early pilots of approaches, which often were described as net positive approaches, were being delivered by projects such as Network Rail's electrification program, particular kind of national highways projects, and some other infrastructure schemes. And although, as Alex said, this is a future requirement for NSIPs, so it's not a current requirement for NSIP schemes. In Natural England, we're increasingly seeing NSIPs committing to this anyway, and it's coming through, and we've got interest from planning inspectors in terms of what the approach should be. And it's been around in policy terms for a bit as well. So it's been part of the National Planning Policy Framework since about 2012, and that's been was more recently updated. And it was also incorporated into the National Infrastructure Strategy, I think, in part as well, having seen actually how it was successfully being implemented through projects like the East West Rail scheme. As Alex said, at the moment, in terms of timeframes, we're working on an assumed introduction for net gain for Town and Country Planning Act developments in late 2023 and for NSIPs in late 2025, although these are subject to commencement orders. And work is underway on future marine net gain approaches as well. So some of you may have seen there was a consultation this summer on what an approach to marine net gain might look like as well. So that's something for the future. And it's likely that, subject to confirmation from government, that the approaches for NSIP will be broadly similar to the approaches for Town and Country Planning Act in terms of that minimum 10% use of the metric, the requirement to secure legally off-site, with delivering off-site, and the kind of timeframes as well. Although all of this is still to be formally confirmed by government, but that's the direction of travel. And as we've said, this is coming through updated national policy statements, which will set out a B&G requirement for NSIPs and some ambition around the scope for actually having a kind of single net gain statement that could be applied across different sectors as well. One other thing to touch upon, and it's not connected to this Environment Act, it's not linked to the legislation in any way, but last year British Standard on Biodiversity Net Gain was published as well, which sets out a process for designing and implementing B&G, and it benefited from considerable amounts of infrastructure engagement in that as well. So it's quite a useful standard to refer to when looking at how to go about embedding best practice around biodiversity net gain. And then so just finally, just to finish on some kind of emerging top tips, if you like, or things that we're seeing and we're having reported back to us in terms of things to be considering that help to make net gain a kind of smoother process to achieve and a kind of a better outcome. So firstly, think about this early, and the earlier you can be thinking about net gain, the more easier you'll find this to achieve. So where you've got scope to think about, where there's options around site selection. I know that's not always possible, but that's useful. And also in terms of incorporating it into early design thinking. The more you can avoid high nature value sites, the easier you'll find net gain to achieve. So it follows the mitigation hierarchy, it reinforces the mitigation hierarchy. And the more you can integrate nature into a scheme design in terms of the wider landscaping, green infrastructure, etc., again, the easier potentially you'll find net gain to deliver. So really encouraging early conversations between ecologists, landscape architects, engineers, rather than leaving it to the last minute to try and green a scheme that's already been kind of designed. Linked to that, retain existing good habitat on the site where you've got it. The more you can retain that, again, the easier you'll find net gain to be achieved. So whereas typically many projects in the past would go and sort of completely clear a site in order to maximize access for equipment, actually, if you've got some good habitat there, don't look at a kind of slash and burn approach. If there's opportunity and scope to protect that and maintain it and potentially enhance it, that will stand you in good stead when it comes to actually being able to deliver that net gain outcome. Alex touched upon the different strategies or the different ways you can achieve net gain, either on-site or off-site or through a combination of the two. And be thinking about that early as well, what works best for you as a project. There are pros and cons with each. If you're delivering off-site, then that needs to be legally secured. So you need to enter into contracts with kind of third-party landowners. For them, it becomes their legal responsibility to deliver, but it does need that kind of legal setup. Whereas on-site, it's less so. And then finally, think about how a scheme can actually deliver the local priorities for nature as well. But again, the metric which has been touched upon, it will reward you the more you are delivering the kind of environmental nature objectives that are wanted in that particular place, and that's through creating or enhancing habitats. One other element of the Environment Act that is due to be introduced are these things called local nature recovery strategies, which will eventually will cover all of England, and they will provide a standardised way of being able to identify and see actually what are the priorities for nature for this place. But there are other strategies that exist which can also do that job. So existing biodiversity opportunity maps, green infrastructure strategies, etc. So just some things to consider. Some feedback we've had around actually if you think about these things, you will find net gain an easier outcome to achieve. But I shall stop there and go over to questions.
Thank you, Nick. That was excellent. We have a few questions in from the audience, but there's room for more should any of you like to put a question in the Q&A panel. So the first question we have is around timing, so perhaps for Alex, but if your NSIP was entering the application process now or before November 25, is it likely they'll be expected to deliver BNG, or will it just be for NSIPs that enter the application process post, assuming it's November 2025?
It's a very good question, Rufus. I'm glad this one has come up, and as with any of these questions, there is a short answer and then there's a slightly longer answer which involves a bit more pragmatism, and I think Nick has already touched on an element of this in his reply as well. So I'll say my piece and then I'll pass over to Nick if I may. So the short answer is that when the relevant provisions of the Environment Act are commenced, we would expect there to be transitional provisions which will give very clear guidance as to which projects the statutory requirements will and won't apply to. And that tends to happen with the introduction of most legislation. I think here it's particularly important because it is an additional consenting requirement, and therefore if you don't know that it's going to apply to you, and it does in the future, you would obviously be prudent to plan for it, but yes, it will all be very clearly set out in statute. I think the expectation is that the transitional provisions would have to latch on to a certain stage in the application cycle for NSIPs, and the two key ones I think would be either the making of the application itself. So, if your application is made before X date, they must comply with the provisions of the Act. And the other one, which is slightly earlier than that, is the mandatory statutory consultation process that NSIPs have to go through. Some projects go through more than one round of statutory consultation, but I think the statutory consultation is another provisional transitional trigger. There's a lot of conditionality in that statement, so forgive me. So that is how I think it would work in terms of the legal mechanisms. Nick's mentioned in his talk that the requirements for BNG, for biodiversity net gain, have been spoken about for some time. They are matters which are being raised. They are questions which have been raised on existing applications, existing NSIP applications that are out there. The statutory provisions are on the statute book. There was a clear direction of travel prior to the new government coming in place. Whether that clear direction of travel is quite still there is perhaps open to debate. I'm not saying that it isn't, but obviously there's an element of a question in there now. And yes, I think what we can say is that promoters of these projects would be prudent to have regard to the regime and to start to think about it in the way that Nick has been referring to.
Thank you, Alex. That was a good answer. Nick, would you like to add anything to Alex's answer on that question?
I mean, that's covered a lot. I mean, essentially, this is a future requirement. So, so if you've got a scheme that goes underway now or has just been consented, there will be no retrospective kind of requirement for you to achieve net gain if that's not expected of you currently. But as Alex said, a number of promoters are already looking at this anyway and sort of anticipating what they think is going to be a future expectation. And obviously you've got other local interests and kind of interested parties, etc., are seeing this as an opportunity and looking to sort of encourage this within schemes. But no, it won't be a retrospective requirement, and it will need to be quite clear at what point it does apply. And we'd expect to see that set out by government when the consultation response when the response to the consultation earlier this year gets published by government as well, which is due.
Thanks, Nick. And I think as Alex alluded to, from a risk management perspective and a pragmatic perspective, I would certainly, as an EIA practitioner myself, would not be advising any client to go to the wire on any sort of process and then not have BNG requirement and then have to defend that through lots of examinations as to why they have purposefully avoided it. It wouldn't put them in a good light. So I think there'll be a adoption of it well in advance of the formal requirement by the wiser developers out there. In terms of our next question, this is around covenants. What are the characteristics of conservation covenants and how do they apply to the title?
I'm wondering if I can defer to a legal opinion on this one to start with.
I was just finding the unmute button, Nick. Forgive me. So yeah, what are the characteristics of them? They will be. I think I probably interpret that question in two ways. The first is what is the nature of the covenant, and then secondly, perhaps what is their purpose. And I think the nature of the covenant is very much a legalistic question. It's one that is addressed through the Environment Act. They will share many similarities with planning obligations, which are usually entered into under Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act, which are obligations to do or not do things, to use land in certain ways or not use land in certain ways. And they're entered into by way of deed, and they are a formalistic legal process, I suppose, and a very well established one. So I think there's that side to it. That is what the characteristics of conservation covenants will be. They will be formal legal agreements in the same way that we're accustomed to seeing with Section 106 agreements or obligations. What is their purpose? Again, we have a bit of detail on that in the Act. They are to be for conservation purposes, which is perhaps a statement of the obvious and perhaps doesn't add much to their name as conservation covenants. They're intended to be for the public good, and I would expect there to be a body of guidance which will emerge, which will provide best practice and guidance around how they are to operate. And Nick, at that point, I would hand over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And the one thing I would sort of add on to that as well is during the passage, so as Alex mentioned, NSIPs were a kind of a late entry to the legislation when it was kind of going through parliaments. The original bill didn't include provision for NSIPs for the mandatory net gain, but it was added to. And then towards the end of the bill's kind of legislative journey, particularly at the House of Lords, there was quite a lot of debate around actually how long a period of time should NSIPs in particular need to kind of manage and maintain net gain for as well. So for the Town and Country Planning Act, it's kind of set out at a kind of minimum of 30 years, and there was a lot of pressure to require a longer period of time for NSIPs. The then DEFRA Minister, Lord Goldsmith, committed to reviewing, particularly for major projects, actually what would be an appropriate time period. And the reason I say all this is because conservation covenants provide you with a legal mechanism in theory and in practice where if you wish to, and it would only be if the landowner was willing, that you could enter into an agreement, a covenant that ran in perpetuity. So if you wish to enter into a much longer term net gain agreement with landowners, that provides you with a legal mechanism for doing so, which is obviously different from Section 106 agreements or things like that as well. But yeah, and then they'll be overseen by responsible bodies, and there's an exercise that organisations can apply to become a responsible body. And as Alex said, it's there to secure kind of environmental benefits from that land.
Thank you, Nick. A couple of practical questions for me, just whilst we're on covenants. I view them as a kind of, and I'm not a lawyer, restrictive covenant based on conservation requirements. And the two things that cropped up for practitioners was one, that 30-year limit, because if you put in the biodiversity again, 30 years later, that habitat's just establishing, someone cuts it down, puts houses on it, and then you've not actually had the biodiversity net gain. I think that's something we'll have to cross eventually. The other aspect is remedy. So if someone ignores that covenant, breaks that covenant, what is the actual enforcement? What is the penalty, so to speak, for the breaking of the covenant? Do either of you have information on that?
On the last point, it's a very good one, and it is something I know that it's a subject of active discussions with the kind of conservation covenant team within government as well, because clearly, across net gain, the question of monitoring and then enforcement, if needed, is a very kind of valid one, and we want to make sure that there is a mechanism through covenants of being able to take action if a landowner has committed to do something and then just clearly hasn't followed through. There'll always be circumstances where an outcome may not have been delivered, and it's no one's fault, because nature can be perverse and your field may have fallen off this cliff into the sea or whatever. But we want to make sure that a landowner isn't able to just receive some monies and then walk away with no intention of doing anything as well. So yeah, there will need to be a mechanism for undertaking some level of enforcement. But yeah,
there is. Yeah, there's they've written the potential future remedies into the Act. So there's a framework for what that enforcement regime might look like, and it is similar to the Section 106 regime. So the Section 106 regime is probably renowned as being one of the more effective elements of planning enforcement. You make a promise in a deed, in a legal agreement, and if you breach it, the courts will generally award an injunction against the party that has breached, and an injunction in favour of the local planning authority, in that case, against the party responsible for the breach, usually preventing further development or occupation of development until such a time as the breach has been remedied. It's an effective, complete enforcement regime. They've written in provision for injunctive relief into the Environment Act, and my expectation is that is the approach that will be taken, and I would expect that to be an effective enforcement regime for the purposes of conservation sites delivering what it is they set out to do. Trying to deliver what it is they set out to deliver. And this is Nick's point about nature not being entirely predictable, and you can't know what the outcome of your efforts is going to be in advance, although increasingly we can hazard a fairly good guess. So that, I think, is enforcement. The other piece about the longevity of the covenant, yes, 30 years is the minimum that has been written in. We'll have to wait and see how this works in practice, but I rather expect that will be a minimum, and different situations will arise in which sometimes that will be considered to be reasonable, and it's, there's a wide range of factors and a wide range of schemes and a wide range of sites which are available. Sometimes that will be appropriate, sometimes it will be more appropriate for the conservation covenant to be longer in length.
Thanks, Alex. Well, just to, not wanting to belabor the point, I totally agree with you. For pre-commencement conditions, the injunction would then be effective. But if you imagine a scenario, HS2 is built, it's been operating for 15 years, there's a bunch of ancient woodland to be planted, and then at some point that is built over, or somehow the covenant is breached. In that scenario, you can't halt construction. It was 10 years ago. It may have been sold 3 times to various different owners, and so that's where you get in the tricky. If we're talking about 30 years, 40-year periods where the assets are built and sold, and possibly not in the same ownership, and then it's how does that then injunction sort of mechanism have effect, and that's where it's less clear.
You're right. It is less clear, and it's a very apt and good distinction, Rufus. You're absolutely right. It is a different situation to where that relief is usually sought, where it's all about the implementation of mitigation prior to completing your build out. So yes, I'd agree with that as a distinction and a challenge, I think, for the regime. I mean, the bottom line, I suppose, will be that the covenants will attach to land and will run with the ownership of the land. So in whoever's hands that conservation land sits, they will potentially be subject to enforcement action under this regime in the event they breach the conservation covenants. I think that is probably where the teeth will sit.
Yeah, so there's a liability issue there, isn't there? Sorry, Nick.
No, I was just going to say the other thing as well that comes into play there is that the land will also be on this national register, which is publicly accessible as well. So part of its purpose is also to provide a kind of an audit rather of where net gain offsite is being delivered. So in part to make sure that the same parcel of land isn't being reused multiple times, fraudulently with different claims of net gain. Also to help people see actually that is a net gain site. It's being something was designed to be delivered there. And if nevertheless a development is consented on that parcel of land, then the baseline value should be what the outcome of that parcel of land was forecast to be for net gain, rather than irrespective of what its actual baseline at the moment in time is. If that makes sense.
And the other point to throw in is that as well as the gain site register, which Nick has referred to, these covenants are the agreements are to be registered as local land charges, which is how Section 106s are broadcast to the public at large, as it were. When you're dealing in land, you carry out a search of the register, and that's the way in which you should be made aware of these things. And that ought to emerge, yes, if there were this situation where somebody had offered a conservation covenant over land and then subsequently development was proposed on top of that, that would be difficult. But I think in theory, I can see the routes by which the regime has been set up to prevent that happening, or making sure that there's an adequate treatment of that situation if it were to arise.
Thank you. Got a few questions here which I think might be quick answers, and not maybe even yes and no's, but we'll see. So what I think might be a quick one: will the gain site register apply to on-site mitigation as well as off-site?
Initially on off-site only, and there is an ambition. Natural England would like it to include on-site. There is a longer-term ambition for it to include on-site, but that's also very much linked to efforts to digitise a planning system as well. So in the short term, expect it to be, I think, only be off-site.
Thank you. And again, that goes to the due diligence, monitoring and enforcement. If people have put a lot of on-site on and then sort of by stealth sort of remove that over time by intensifying the site, that's an issue that we managed.
But that Rufus should be controlled under existing controls that apply to these sorts of projects as well. I mean, in principle, I'm agreeing that yes, that could be something to be concerned by, but I think the existing
mechanisms in place.
Yes.
So quick question here. Again, it was around interest to know if there could be a move to include on-site habitat in the register. That's the same question, but from a different person. This is to the point we're just saying, how will the on-site habitats therefore be recorded or secured if they're not on that register?
So for Town and Country Planning Acts, they'll be secured through planning obligations. And I know we're waiting for a bit more detail from government precisely around this, because there is reference in the Act to on significant on site as well, and the kind of what is significant and what's not, and we're expecting DEFRA to clarify that. But yes, it will be secured through a planning obligation. I know concerns have been raised as well around enforcement powers, and there have been discussions with, and some of that was linked into the LURB around potential to strengthen enforcement powers as well. But again, we kind of waiting a bit more for more detail on some of this.
Thank you, Nick. Question for Nick again. Any update on when guidance for the local nature recovery strategy development will be available?
Sadly not. I'm not going to say it's various things got held up because of the political issues over the summer, and then with the new government as well. So yes, we're waiting.
There's a question here which I think you will know the answer to. I think there is an answer. But will this develop a market for buying biodiversity credits and space for organisations to offer credits to infrastructure providers? Would it make sense for Natural England to get ahead and manage this or offer this to ensure good environmental outcomes in priority areas targeted first?
Yeah, so the whole basis of the approach is in part to encourage and incentivize the establishment of a market, and many organisations are stepping up and coming forward. So basically, any land where habitat creation or enhancement has occurred for the sole purpose of biodiversity net gain after the 30th of January 2020. So there's a specific date before which it can't count, but after that date can be counted and be sold to developers. So there's growing levels of investment coming into this space as well, with people seeing a kind of potential market opportunity here. Landowners, the price will be whatever the landowner can negotiate with the buyer, and people can include all of their costs on that as well, the legal costs, overhead, etc., etc. There's also an advantage to be had in creating or enhancing habitats early as well. So and this is through kind of habitat banks. So this is the idea that you've established a habitat potentially 2-3 beyond years ahead of the development impact, and the metric basically rewards you for doing that. And it means as a landowner, you're able to generate more units from that same parcel of land than you would otherwise. And for a developer, it's a potentially cheaper way for you to achieve net gain if you contract with a habitat bank as well. So yeah, there's an active market being established around this. And I've forgotten what the second part of the question was. Sorry, Rufus.
No, I think you've answered it. I mean,
Okay.
I would say just for that person, is that information? Is there information around that on the Natural England website, or is there a dedicated website?
It's one of these watch this space. So we're expecting when government's consultation response gets published, it to say more on the question about habitat banking. And there's a related issue which won't go into in detail, but around stacking and bundling, and that's basically to what extent can you combine payments for different environmental services, so carbon and biodiversity net gain, for example, or nutrient neutrality and net gain. And again, government's been working on some guidance around this and some rules, and we're waiting for that to be published as well. But that will be a useful piece of information for landowners as well in terms of what they can sell to whom.
For any non-experts on the call, I'll just briefly say that the benefits of stacking multiple benefits from a piece of land in that sense is increases the business case for habitat creation if you can sell a carbon credit, biodiversity credit, a nutrient credit. So that's a positive thing, but obviously it's open to sort of double counting or fraudulent double counting of it. So that's why this guidance is going to be key to just set the ground rules on how that should be done. Was that okay? Was that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to disagree with anything which has been said there. Yes, there is an emerging market for these credits, and it's not just biodiversity credits that we're talking about when we talk about what that is going to look like as we move forward. And I think it's going to be a very interesting time for developers as to how they navigate that process and what is available and where it's available. For me, and I think this will come out in the wash in due course when we get more guidance, but the really interesting bit is how that system works within the spatial hierarchy that we know is intended to apply, and the prioritization of on-site and then off-site and then credits. The intention isn't that you just go to market and buy your credits and be done. I think that much is clear, but equally that ought to be an option that is available. And I think for me, the difficulty is going to be in how that hierarchy, how that preference is calibrated.
Yeah, and just so we've used the word credits quite loosely so far as well, and it might be worth just clarifying at this point that any biodiversity that you deliver on site or any that you contract to deliver off site through a third party, it gets, in terms of biodiversity next gain, gets described as units. So you're buying or selling units. Statutory biodiversity credit, so this last resort option that Alex is referring to, that's something you're purchasing from government, and they're referred to as statutory biodiversity credits, but people often refer to units as credits as well. And it's just good to be aware of that, because people can be talking at cross purposes occasionally.
And I got the impression from your earlier conversation, Nick, responding to Alex, that if you buy the credits, or if you buy off-site units, then perhaps you have to potentially buy more than if you were doing it on site. So there's a built-in incentive. Was that correct, Nick, or not?
There's a policy incentive to say consider on-site first, but that on-site might not always be appropriate either,
Sure.
either ecologically or just in terms of the design. So the value of a unit is the same. One unit on-site is worth the same as one unit off-site, but there does come a point where where you're delivering off-site is significantly farther away from the development then some negative multipliers begin to kick in. Typically, that's if it's with outside of that particular planning authority's area or wider natural character area. There's some differences around the coast. So distance from the impact site can have an impact on the value of a unit. As to going back to what I was saying earlier about linking to local kind of nature priorities. So the more you deliver an outcome that actually locally someone has said, we want to see more of habitat X or Y, and that gives you a positive value as well. So that same parcel of land can have a slightly higher unit value than it otherwise would do. And then the statutory credits are only where if you are unable to achieve net gain on site, and for some reason there's no availability off site for you to be able to contract with, then you have a problem then as a developer, because you legally have to achieve net gain. You can't get consent unless you do. And so that's where this statutory credit system is designed to come in, to say you can't allow for developments to then just get stuck and in limbo. They need a way out. So they'll be priced at a deliberately higher price point than would be available through the market to try and act as a deterrence. There's likely also to be some kind of tests that you need to satisfy to be able to say, actually, no, I have looked to the market, nothing's available, therefore I can get credits. But yes, then you'll buy those governments that will then get invested in strategic habitat schemes as well. So it's a sort of last resort option, just to make sure that everyone ultimately can achieve net gain. And I see there is a question in the chat where someone's asked, have people been able to, what's the people's experience of being able to get credits today? And just to say, these statutory credits don't become available until the enforcement for biodiversity net gain is in place. So they won't become available until mandatory net gain starts.
And I was going to add one point to sure. That wonderfully comprehensive answer, if I can, which is there's a really interesting overlap here with how a promoter of a scheme goes about securing land to deliver on-site mitigation. And it's all about compulsory acquisition. So there are compulsory acquisition powers which are available to promoters of the projects that we're talking about. It's an aspect of the regime which enables the delivery of nationally significant infrastructure projects. It's what it's been set up there to do. So promoters have compulsory acquisition powers if they can satisfy the statutory tests that apply, if there's a compelling case in the public interest for the acquisition of those powers. Where that sits with net gain is really interesting, because one might naturally infer that if this regime is being brought in, that would mesh with that existing regime, and you would be able to use those powers to acquire land for net gain purposes, which is a question which has come up in the past in different forums. interestingly, the consultation that was released in January touches on the point, but then it gives an indication that it doesn't expect compulsory acquisition to be used for the acquisition of land for net gain purposes. So there's I think there's a tension there, and I find that interaction quite interesting, and we're wait to see how that emerges in practice.
Okay, well, we're nearly out of time. There is a few more questions which I don't think we're going to get to, but what I will do is I will pick them up and we will take them up. There are some other avenues. So for those of you that aren't aware, there is an EIA masterclass conference being run by Waterfront, which I'll be chairing. That's on the 1st of December, and I'm sure these topics will rise again. Similarly, there's a Waterfront masterclass NSIP conference in March 1st and 2nd. And for those of you that are IEMA members, we have a IEMA conference for 2 days of impact assessment on October the 20th and the 21st. So lots of opportunities there. And I know there's a lot of biodiversity net gain material and webinars, etc., circulating also. So that just leaves me to give Alex and Nick any final words, parting words.
I think it's a really exciting period. I mean, yes, there's a lot we don't know, and yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but it's fantastic to see net gain coming forward through so many projects anyway. I think it's begun to make its own case for itself, and hopefully that's only to the good for the natural environment and also for the kind of communities and places which we live and work. So I think this is an exciting time.
Absolutely.
And I would echo Nick's views there. I think it's all very positive in the broader scheme of things. I think for me, what's really interesting is how these mechanisms are going to emerge in practice and how they're going to fit with the existing consenting regimes and processes that we've become accustomed to, because they do tend to operate on a slightly different level, a much broader level, I think, compared to the traditional mitigation that you have seen associated with infrastructure projects of this type. So for me, the proof will be in the pudding as to where it emerges, and I think it will have its teething problems, I'm sure, as any regime is prone to do. But I think that how it emerges in practice is the really interesting bit for us all to see, I think, in the future.
Thank you. And Nick, there were a couple of questions on marine, which I don't think we've got time to go into, but is there a further session or information on the marine net gain or a consultation? Where would people look for marine net gain info?
So the marine net gain consultation closed relatively recently. So there should be a government response coming out to that, I'd imagine probably in about 2, maybe 3 months' time. So watch this space on that. And I'm sure colleagues involved in some of the marine work would be very happy as well to kind of, if Waterfront wanted to do an event, for example, or something like that, I'd be very happy to support that. But yeah, we're expecting kind of more clarity to come through on marine in the next couple of months.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Alex. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for all our participants today. You will be emailed an evaluation form, so please give any feedback on the event to Waterfront, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Cheers. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Alex.